Welcome to the Therapy and Prayer Podcast. Here you'll find the intersection between faith and mental health. I'm your host, Camille. I'm a licensed therapist and clinical social worker, but more importantly, I'm a Christian who really loves the Lord. And I'm just trying to navigate this life without falling victim to it, just like everyone else. Here we take a faith-based approach to all things mental health and wellness, because the Bible tells us to guard our heart and mind, and sometimes we need a little bit of help with that. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Therapy and Prayer Podcast. My name is Camille, I'm your host, and I'm so happy that you're here. Thank you so much for coming back, and thanks for stopping by. If it's your first time, I hope that you'll stay a while. Before I forget, go ahead and subscribe to the channel or subscribe to the show wherever you're listening. I literally never say that, and I know that I'm supposed to, so we're going to try to start incorporating those things. I hope that you guys are doing good. How's your week going so far? If you ask me how I'm doing, I honestly don't know. That's been my answer a lot. That's my response is that I don't know how I'm doing, how I'm feeling. I've been feeling a lot of things lately. And I guess a part of that is what we're going to talk about today. I saw Inside Out 2. If you haven't, go watch it. Go and watch it. It was amazing. But I think that it's timely because I want to talk about emotional regulation today. We're going to get a little bit educational, but I want to talk about emotional regulation, or another way of saying that is how we can have more control over our emotions and the way that we use those emotions. I'm not saying that we are going to learn how to control whether or not we feel things, but we're going to talk about what we can do with those feelings and how we can have a little bit more control over how those feelings show up for us and the function of those feelings. So first things first, we cannot control how things make us feel. We can't control those impulsive emotional reactions that we have, but we can control how we respond and what we do with those emotions. The way that I typically explain this to folks is the difference between responding and reacting. When you're reacting from an emotional place, that's just your impulse. That's the first thing that comes up. The first thing that you feel, you're acting on that. So we might have an outburst, or we might say something that we regret and we can't take it back, but we were speaking from a place of pain. That's when we allow our emotions to dictate our actions. But we want to lean more towards learning to respond thoughtfully to things, meaning that we can have an emotional experience. We're going to have emotional experiences because we're human, but we don't have to allow those emotions to dictate what we do. We want to get to a place where we can take a minute and slow down and actually respond logically and thoughtfully instead of just acting based off of our emotions. So if you have seen Inside Out, the first or the second one, then you know that there's this control panel and that the emotions are kind of taking turns at the control panel. And that's actually a really good visual because we kind of want to be at our own control panel, and we want to be able to know when it's appropriate to express certain things and when it's not. We want to know when maybe we just need a moment to feel what we're feeling before we react or respond to something. We want to be in the driver's seat a little bit more. We want to be more active in the way that our emotions show up for us. We might as well learn how to do this because we cannot get away from the fact that we are emotional beings and that we're going to feel so many different things. But it can be really difficult to feel in control, especially when we feel really big emotions, really intense ones. And it just kind of seems like they can overtake us sometimes. And that's where this whole concept of emotional regulation comes into play. We need to regulate our emotions. We kind of need to learn how to tell them what to do, or tell them when they can relax a little bit, or when we need them at the forefront. So if I say we're learning to control our emotions, I'm not saying that we're learning to control how we feel, but we are learning to control what we do with those feelings. Hopefully that's making sense. Hopefully you're following me. And I also want to talk about the role that spiritual transformation plays in all of this. The role of spiritual transformation in emotional regulation is a pretty big one because it affects the way that we interpret the world around us. And so, we'll get into it a little bit later, but We're going to see how those two kind of connect. This is one of the ways that the world of mental health and spiritual wellness really overlap and can work really, really well together. We want to get to a place where we are at such peace in our spirit that we're not as affected by the things of the world and that we are not as easily triggered by certain things. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But beyond that, we do need to be able to regulate our emotions so that we can continue to function in the world around us. If we're walking around without any type of control and we're just going based off of our impulses at every second, then that's going to be a bit of a mess. That's going to be a little bit of a mess. So we need to learn and we need to have some tools to help us regulate when things get really, really intense. So I want to talk about this concept called the window of tolerance. We'll see how my editing self feels if we want to put like a visual of it up on the screen for you. But this whole concept of the window of tolerance basically says that each person has a threshold for emotions. And we have like a window, right, where we have some healthy fluctuation. Our feelings are never like super linear. They're not monotone. So there's always some fluctuation in that. If I stub my toe, I'm not going to smile about it, right? And that's not an overreaction to say like, ouch, that hurt, and maybe to be a little bit irritated about that. Sure, that's a reasonable fluctuation. And that's within that window of tolerance, right? Because I might go to irritable and then I might come right back down to my baseline relatively quickly without causing any damage to myself or anyone around me. Now, an overreaction to that might be I stub my toe and I get so mad that I break a window and I throw the nearest thing to me. And I just go on like this rampage and now I've caused a mess in the house all because I stubbed my toe. That means that I have now moved outside of my window of tolerance because this is not a reasonable response or reaction to that thing, to that trigger or to that stressor. So everyone has a window of tolerance where we have reasonable fluctuations and we can go outside of the window of tolerance, either above or below it. Now, when we go above the window of tolerance, that's when we have those overreactions, or that's when we experience what we call hyperarousal. And that's when we're like really angry, or we're like short tempered, or we're really irritable. Maybe we're crying. But this is when we are maybe a little bit more explosive. Now, when we go under that window of tolerance, that's when we go into hypoarousal. And that's when we're underreacting to things. That's when we're just shutting down. Maybe we're dissociating. Maybe we are isolating from other people. Maybe we're getting really depressed. That's when we are underreacting and we just have less. So think about your own window of tolerance. Think about the way that your emotions fluctuate, and think about if you have a tendency of overreacting or of underreacting. Both of them are indicators that we are struggling to regulate our emotions. When we're hyperaroused, we're essentially going into our fight or flight, right? So the things that cause these fluctuations in our emotions, for the sake of this conversation, we're going to call them triggers. I don't think that they're always trauma triggers, and so I want to use that word a little bit loosely. But triggers or stressors are really anything that can cause an emotional reaction within you. These are the things that contribute to these fluctuations, these either reasonable or unreasonable fluctuations. So in hyperarousal, we go into fight or flight. In hypoarousal, that's maybe when we go into our freeze. And all of these are trauma responses, essentially. So whether you're being triggered by a specific trauma or if there is just a certain stressor that always like takes you there, we need to learn what affects us. We need to learn what causes some of these fluctuations. That's only a part of it. Part of it is learning what causes these fluctuations, and the other part of it is learning how can we interact with our emotions in that moment so that we can remain within that window of tolerance. And then there's another part of this, which is how can we expand our window of tolerance? For some people, that window is very narrow, which means it really doesn't take much to go into hyperarousal or hypoarousal. It doesn't take much to go into that fight or flight for some people. And so there are some ways to widen that window of tolerance. As we heal and as we grow and as we establish healthy connections and healthy patterns and healthy habits, that window of tolerance widens. On the flip side of that, though, if we experience more trauma and we become even more dysregulated on a regular basis, and that window of tolerance can shrink and can become narrow. So that's why it's important that we really are tending to all of our needs, our mental and emotional and spiritual needs, because it's going to affect us. One thing is always going to affect the other when we're talking about this. We are whole people. We have to think about the whole self here. So if you are like super stressed and you don't have any outlet, you don't have any safe people around you, you don't have a sense of community, and you aren't well rested, you're not well fed, well hydrated, that window of tolerance is going to shrink. And then you're going to become even more irritable. It's going to take much less for you to move outside of that. And let's say that you're already starting with a bit of a narrow window of tolerance. The more that you learn about yourself, the more you learn about your coping skills, the more you learn about what makes you feel safe and secure, the more you establish these safe and secure relationships, and the more you heal from past experiences, then that window of tolerance is going to widen, and it's going to take much more than it used to take for you to move outside of that. So maybe you'll become less reactive and things will start to like roll off your shoulders a little bit more. I think that's the goal for most of us. We want to get to a place where we are less affected by the world around us. Not that we are unaffected at all, but we want to get to a place where we're a little bit less affected. We don't want to have these overreactions or these underreactions. We don't want our emotional experiences to stop what it is that we're doing. If you're someone who is easily dysregulated, or not even easily, but if you know what it feels like to really feel completely out of control of your emotions and to feel just so like kind of lost and confused and a little bit helpless even, then you understand what I mean. We want to get to a place where our emotions don't have that kind of effect on us. Now, let me also say that this is not all encompassing of depressive episodes, manic episodes. There is always going to be some overlap, but I'm speaking generally about emotional regulation. If you are in if you're in a depressive episode, or if you are in any sort of mental health episode, then that might change. It might look different when you're in that episode than when you're not. So for the sake of this conversation, think about when we are not in an episode of any kind, and that we're just kind of at our baseline and we want to learn how to manage our emotions. Because for some people, if you're like me, when my emotions kind of get out of control, when I feel dysregulated, I get really paralyzed. And I think I go into hypoarousal. Like everything feels so much more difficult. My body starts to feel heavier. Like my legs feel heavy and like it's hard to walk. I start moving so much slower. I start dissociating. It can get kind of scary. And in those moments, I feel so just out of control. And like there's little that I can do, even though I have a whole toolbox of things. I have a toolbox of things, and I know what some of my coping skills are, and I know how to use my mindfulness techniques, and sometimes they work and then sometimes they don't. And it's when they don't work, or it's when I can't think about reaching for one of them. It's when I'm so consumed with my feelings and with my emotions that I can't even think about reaching for a coping skill, or I can't even think about reaching for my phone to call someone, that I just feel so stuck and so paralyzed and just really kind of helpless. If you have experienced anything like that, even on the opposite end of it, where you just feel like you're like, once the lid has popped off, like you can't put it back on and you're just like exploding everywhere. You feel like a volcano that's erupting and you can't do anything about it. If you've been in either of those two camps, then you know what I mean when I say that we want to be able to get to a place where our emotions don't have that kind of control over us. And we want to be able to just let some things kind of roll off, because that can be really, really debilitating. And if you haven't experienced that, good on you. But for the rest of us, this is an ongoing kind of process of learning how and when to regulate our emotions appropriately and safely. So let's talk about our triggers for a moment. Triggers and just stress in general. I want to talk about how we respond to them. So earlier when I mentioned fight or flight, these are trauma responses or fear responses. So when something in our environment is making us go into fight, flight, or freeze, there's a part of us that is interpreting that thing as a threat of some sort. That's what it means when we're triggered. It means that there's a part of us that becomes fearful. There's a part of us that goes back to a place when we felt unsafe, unseen, unheard. A part of us goes back there, and that part of us, or that part of our brain, feels like we have to go into a protective mode. The thing is that when we immediately go into that space mentally, that we're not always able to be present enough to ask ourselves, is this a real or imagined threat? And also, if we don't know what our triggers are, then it's really hard to trace whether they're real or not. Sometimes I wake up and I don't know why I'm feeling how I'm feeling. I've had a lot of days like that recently. I don't really know why I'm feeling what I'm feeling. And I can barely tell you what I'm feeling, but I know I'm feeling something. I know that it's uncomfortable, and I know that it's really heavy, and I know that it's slowing me down. Those are the hardest for me. But what I also know about myself is that I don't always respond to stress very well. I'm kind of easily flustered and like thrown off my game. So it doesn't really take too much for me to have some fluctuation in my emotional regulation. I also know that when I don't have a sense of stability in one way or another, or that if I'm in the middle of a transition, that I feel like I've lost my footing. And that makes me feel really dysregulated too. So sometimes it's a trigger, and sometimes it's just learning how we deal with stress and finding some healthier ways to deal with that stress. If it is a trigger, and if it is reminding you of a trauma that you've experienced, or if it's taking you back to a painful place, then that is an opportunity to lean into a part of you that maybe needs a little bit more healing. Maybe that is showing you that we're not as healed in this particular area as we thought we were, or as we hoped we were. If we're easily triggered and easily dysregulated by the same kinds of things, if there's a pattern that's showing up, then at that point we have a choice about whether or not we want to address that pattern, or if we just want to kind of keep going into this dysregulated state. But anytime we're talking about mental health and behaviors that are a result of our mental health, we want to look for certain patterns. Do you respond to stress the same way every time? Are you triggered by the same kind of thing or the same kind of people? What is the pattern? What's the commonality? That's going to help us get down to the root of what the actual issue might be for you. And when we get down to that root, then it's going to be easier to really kind of step back and assess, like, is this a real threat? Am I actually in danger? Or is this something that just feels dangerous because it feels familiar in that way? If you're able to get to that point and you're able to say, well, I'm not actually in danger, but it just feels that way, then that's when we need to reach for some of those tools. Because if it's a real danger, if it's a real threat, then you need to get to safety. But most of the time it's not. And so if we can get to a point where we know I'm feeling triggered right now, or I'm feeling dysregulated, then that's when we reach for some of those tools. Now, when I say tools, when I say coping skills or coping tools, that can be a lot of different things. That can be pretty much anything. But some of the main ones are ones that help you come back to reality, the ones that help you stay grounded in the moment. We talk about grounding and mindfulness a lot because that is one of the most effective ways of emotional regulation. Because when we're feeling dysregulated, it's our nervous system that's dysregulated. So it really is also a physical thing that's happening. And we need to regulate our nervous system by slowing down our breathing and reestablishing contact through one or multiple of our five senses. So mindfulness is really, really helpful for that. Get outside and touch some grass. If you watched Inside Out, then you know that at the end, after I'm not going to do no spoilers because I really want y'all to go see it. But there was a certain point where the main girl Riley, where she was touching the bench. Did you catch it? If you know, then you know. But towards the end, where she just had like a rough moment, and then she was like feeling the bench and she was feeling the wood. That is an example of mindfulness. You're coming back to reality and to this present moment through one of your five senses. And you can use mindfulness in pretty much anything that you're doing. go get a snack, not just so that you can eat something and you can taste something, but if you have to prepare the snack, then you're also using the senses of touch. Maybe you're using the sense of smell. So food really engages multiple senses, which is why it's always a good one. But anything having to do with mindfulness, this is where deep breathing can come in sometimes as well. There are lots of different forms of deep breathing. My favorite that I often go to and that I tell people is called box breathing. I like it because all you have to do is just count to 4. You count to 4 over and over again. You inhale for 4 counts, you hold for 4 counts, exhale for 4 counts, and then hold for 4 counts. And then inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4, just over and over and over again. I like that one because sometimes when we're feeling so dysregulated, our brain is doing like 1,000 things at once or like nothing at all. And a way to get out of that, a good way to get out of that is to give your brain a specific task. So if the only task you're giving your brain is just keep counting to 4, then that can actually help to slow down that breathing. And that can help bring you back to the present moment and get back within that window of tolerance. Now, outside of mindfulness, everyone is going to have different things that help them to feel relaxed, that help them to be in a better mood. So think about what those things are for you. They can be big or small, but I really think that it's better to have a list of small things because the big things are not always available to you. If what makes you feel better is going to the beach, that's great, but you can't always go to the beach. If you're dysregulated in the middle of a meeting at work, you're not going to be able to get up and go right to the beach. But you might be able to take some deep breaths, or you might be able to like fidget with a piece of jewelry, or you might be able to like draw some circles on your paper or whatever it is. Like there are still some things that you can do, but you might not be able to get up and go to the beach. So we need to think of things that are small, that are mobile, that are easily accessible, that can help us come out of that emotional state and back into a logical one. For me, some of those things are like anything that has to do with like crafting or anything creative. I've got tons of coloring books. I've got lanyard on my desk. I'm big on like sensory items too. So I've got like some little like sensory toys around me all the time. Sometimes I just go and hug my dog. Sometimes I just go and stand outside and just take some deep breaths. I'll put on some worship music because I like creative things and I like artsy things. So what are those things for you? And have a list of them and have them easily accessible to you, easily available to you, because you never really know when you're going to be triggered. Now, as you start learning more about your triggers and about yourself, then sometimes you actually can plan for potential triggers or potential stressors. Let's say if we're going on a trip and you know that travel can make you feel really stressed and make you feel really anxious. Maybe you can plan ahead for some of those things. Make sure that you're prepared. Make sure that you have, I don't know, your own snacks on the plane, that you pack, or that you have the information and don't have to rely on someone else to give you the information. So we can plan for some of those things. But then there are those that we cannot plan for. You cannot anticipate walking down the aisle at the grocery store and you hear a song that reminds you of your loved one that passed away and now you're triggered and you're crying in the middle of the grocery store. We cannot plan for that, right? So we need to be able to respond for those things that we cannot plan for. The ideal outcome here is that we can get to a point where that window of tolerance widens and there's not much that dysregulates us. And in order to do that, this is where some of the spiritual transformation can come into play, because in order to widen that window of tolerance, depending on who you are and what you're carrying, you might need a level of healing that is beyond your own human capacity. You might need a supernatural level of healing, right? Or of deliverance. You might need to be transformed and to be, I don't know, maybe purified in some ways so that we don't view the world around us the same way. We need God's help healing from our trauma. We need his help letting go of anger. We need his help in detaching from external outcomes of things. And this is all the stuff that dysregulates us. When you get to a point where you can really surrender these triggers and stressors to God, then it makes it easier to deal with them. It does not take them away. But for me, it's the reminder that I don't have to carry it by myself. When I feel dysregulated, and if I'm being honest, I've felt dysregulated a lot lately. Has been it's been kind of a chaotic time for me. And so I've been really dysregulated, and I've been struggling through it. And so again, this episode is for me. But when I'm in those moments, and when it feels like so all encompassing, it feels so impossible. And if it feels difficult for me to really move forward in doing much of anything. And I feel incredibly alone in those moments. But the peace comes from knowing that God is with you in your dysregulation. When I'm feeling that way, I feel like a bad everything. I feel like a bad adult, like a bad therapist, like a bad person, I feel like a bad everything, like I'm not really doing much of anything right. And to know that God is not only with me in the middle of it, but that he sees me in the middle of it. Because honestly, when I'm feeling that way, I feel like I can't share it with many people, not because I'm ashamed, but because I really don't have the words to share what it is that I'm feeling. I don't know why I'm feeling it. So I don't know what I need. So I can't tell you how you can help me. So I keep a lot of that to myself. But to know that God sees it, God knows every part of it. He knows the unnamed parts of it that I really can't even name. Not only does he know it and see me, but he loves me still. He is not judging me for it. He's not condemning me for it. He's not rejecting me for it. He doesn't get tired of it. And he actually is in control and can do something about it. When our emotions feel that big, then it can really feel like they have control over us, right? Our feelings can feel bigger than they are. That sounds like a weird sentence as I'm saying it, but I hope you're following me. They can feel bigger than they actually are. A feeling is just that. It's something that exists inside of you. A feeling is not a fact. It might be a fact that you feel this way, but if you feel like this is the worst day of your life and the world is ending, that's not a fact. That's just a feeling. But that feeling can feel like a fact. It can feel so real. And so when we lean into the fact that God is already with us in our dysregulation, not the fact that we're inviting God to join us in it, but that he is already with us in it, then for me at least, it shrinks the feeling a little bit back to the size that it actually is. I'm never going to say that we should just ignore our feelings and not acknowledge that they're there. Feelings are my bread and butter, honestly, but it puts it back in the appropriate place. And it reminds me who's actually in control. It reminds me what's actually important. The verse that's coming to mind is the one that says that we fight not against flesh and blood, but against principalities. And that just is a reminder that the war is internal. The warfare is internal. I think that when we are dysregulated, that we are so much more vulnerable to spiritual warfare. I don't think that I'm saying that emotional dysregulation is spiritual warfare, but I think that makes you more vulnerable to spiritual warfare because in that moment, the roles become skewed. I think about we've got our spiritual self, we've got our emotional self, we've got our mental self, we've got our physical self. And maybe there's like a bit of a hierarchy, but the spirit is always number one. Everything else, y'all can kind of take turns being number 2, 3, and 4, however you want to do it. But I think sometimes in those moments, our emotional self tries to creep up to be bigger than the spirit in those moments. And I think that's what makes us vulnerable to the spiritual warfare because it makes us feel less in control. It makes us feel like a victim instead of like a victor. And we know that we are victorious already. So I think that it would be frivolous to say that dysregulation is spiritual warfare and that it's not real, and that it's just spiritual warfare and that we just need to pray it away. I think that would be minimizing, and I don't believe that that is true. But I do think that if we do not include God in it, if we do not go to him with our dysregulation, that we are leaving ourselves open to a type of warfare that could be really, really damaging. And so that's even more reason that we need to learn how to deal with these things, and we need to learn how to utilize these tools that God has given us at our disposal, in addition to talking to him through it and letting him walk you through it. I posted on TikTok and Instagram the other day just about this whole thought about God being with us through the turbulence. I was on a flight a while ago, and when the pilot said, like, buckle up because we're going through some turbulence, and I saw that we went through a thick layer of clouds, and on the other side of the clouds, you guys, it was the most beautiful, majestic view I've ever seen. It was a sunrise flight, and so it was like this layer of clouds that we were above, and then just the most beautiful sunrise. And the clouds, they kind of looked like water, but it just was so beautiful. But in that moment, it was just really a reminder that God is with us in the turbulence. He's carrying us through the thick layer of clouds to the other side, and he wants us to get to the other side of it. Whether that turbulence is in the form of a panic attack, an anxiety attack, whether that turbulence is a depressive episode or a manic episode, whether that turbulence is feeling super isolated or overwhelmed and feeling kind of paralyzed and like you can't move and can't do anything, God is with you in that turbulence. And he's carrying you through it. He's willing to carry you through it. He wants to carry you through it. But when we do not acknowledge his presence in it, and when we do not surrender the control to him in that moment, and when we try to hold on to it ourselves instead, or when we don't do anything about it and we just let it take us over, then we are yielding to the flesh and not to the spirit. We have to remember that even when we don't feel like we're in control, God has never lost 1 ounce of control. I'll just speak for myself. I need that reminder sometimes that even when I don't feel in control, God is still as in control as he has always been and always will be. And that's really comforting to me. I've been in the Psalms lately as I've been in this dysregulated state. And today I was reading Psalms 118, and it just was talking about the mercy of God. It was talking about how merciful he is, consistently merciful. And there are times in my life where I've needed different types of mercy. But that was so on time because I was feeling just so consumed, and I just needed mercy from my feelings. I needed mercy from the helplessness that was starting to creep up. I needed mercy. I needed deliverance. But it just was a reminder that because God is so merciful, he doesn't want to just watch us struggle. He always provides a way out. He always provides a lamb in the bush. He always provides in our struggle. At church on Sunday, we were talking about Jonah and how when Jonah got swallowed by the fish, we might interpret that as punishment, but maybe that was actually protection. Maybe that was actually mercy, because it allowed Jonah the time to actually sit and pray and talk to God, because he didn't talk to God till he got in the fish, okay? He didn't talk to God until he was in that fish. And so maybe the fish was the mercy, and it was what he needed to actually turn to God. And so maybe sometimes when we're in these dysregulated states, maybe that is our reminder to turn to God. Or maybe that's our reminder that God is still providing for you in the middle of the struggle, and that he's not waiting for you to get it together before he has something for you. And that was really helpful for me, because I know that the warfare is constant, but especially when I'm feeling vulnerable in this way. And I can't go to war in the spirit by myself. I need God to help me with that, okay? So that reminder that he's with me in the struggle, he's with me in the suffering, just brought me some like immediate comfort. I don't have my prayer journal with me, but I wish I did, because me and God have just we just been talking, and we've been talking in that format. Um, but what he has been showing me and reminding me is that I don't have to really know what I don't have to be able to name what I'm feeling in order to get through it. God's not relying on me for information about what I'm going through before he can help me with it. He just wants to know that I'm looking for him in the middle of it because he's there. And honestly, I don't know, man. I just think, isn't it a slap in the face to ignore God's presence in the moments where we need him the most? What must it be like for God to always be present, just constantly, and to not be acknowledged? He's there and he wants to help, and we're just acting like he's not. That makes you feel a little bit bad. So for me, it's been really helpful to acknowledge that God is already there. He knows the things that I don't. He can name the things that I cannot. And that is so, so comforting. When I think about that verse that talks about taking your thoughts captive, I think that really means giving them to God, letting God have control over them when I can't. And as we continue to grow in the spirit and just to grow in our relationship with him, as the spirit in us just grows and grows and develops more and more and more, then our attachment to these external things, these stressors and these triggers, our attachment to these things changes. There's a verse. Okay, this is one of my memory verses. It's Romans 15:13. It says, "May the God of all hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that you may abound in hope by the power of the Holy Spirit." And so what I understand that to mean is that over time, we are filled with joy and peace instead of worry and stress with all these external things. It's not that we don't have to interact with external stress anymore because we live in the world where stress exists. There's just nothing that we can do about that. But as we are transformed spiritually, we are filled with joy and peace and hope. Those don't go anywhere when we go through stressful things. Those don't go anywhere when we deal with emotional things. We want to get to a place where the joy and the peace and the hope is the foundation for everything else that we feel and experience and go through. We want to get to the point where those things are the default and not dependent on what we're dealing with externally. And the only way that we can do that is by allowing God to transform us from the inside. The only way that we can do that is to allow the Holy Spirit to work in us and through us. But if we are still relying on our own intellect and our own experiences and our own understanding and our own knowledge, then we're not going to be able to navigate the world from a place of the Spirit as God has intended for us to do. So spiritual transformation and emotional regulation really do go hand in hand. When we embrace the spiritual transformation, it makes the emotional regulation that much easier. There have been times where I felt dysregulated and I felt far from God. And then there's been times where I felt dysregulated and have known that God is still with me. Sometimes the difference is just that I'm able to get to that truth that God is still with me a little bit quicker. Sometimes that's it. Sometimes it's that I'm still willing to talk to him through it. I'm still willing to talk to him about it. Sometimes that's the difference. So you're still going to experience these human things because we are human, but it's how we experience them, how we move through them, how we allow them to affect us that's going to be impacted by our spiritual transformation. On a previous episode, I talked about when we when we do treatment planning and therapy, that the things that we look for is a frequency, intensity, and duration of our symptoms. And as we are thinking about allowing the spirit to grow in us, more of the spirit and less of the flesh, we're looking for those similar kind of things. Not that we won't experience these things or that we won't feel big emotions, but maybe we'll feel them or we'll be affected by them less frequently or less intensely or for shorter amounts of time. I want us to really start looking at growth and progress and evidence of God's presence in multiple ways. It's not just if God doesn't take this thing away, then he must not be with me. That's not it. Is he helping me to walk through it easier? Is he helping me to walk through it quicker? Is he helping me to walk through it a little bit lighter? You're still going to go through it. You're still going to walk through it, but the way that you walk through it is evidence of his presence and of his mercy. And I think that when we have a more spiritual perspective, we're able to see that as provision. Whereas if we don't have that perspective, and if we only are coming from the place of the flesh, then we may not see that as provision. We may only be looking for one type of provision, one type of deliverance. And when we are only looking for that one type, then we miss what God is potentially doing in us. I don't want to miss none of my blessings, okay? We want to be open to the work that God is doing within us. And we want to look for the evidence of that by the way that we're able to move through these really emotionally dysregulating moments. Okay, so that's going to bring us to our scripture for the day. Let's see what the word has to say about some of this. Today's scripture comes from Deuteronomy 31 and verse 8. It says, "The Lord is the one who goes ahead of you. He will be with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed." I think this is just like that turbulence and going through the clouds that I was talking about. I think that we need a reminder sometimes that God is going to be with us, I think, whether we like it or not. And maybe I just need a reminder sometimes that there's nothing that I could do to make God not be with me. He has already gone ahead of me, and simultaneously, he is with me. That's the thing about God. God being God, he can do that, okay? He can be everywhere all at once. He is ahead of me, and he is with me. That is enough to remove the fear of whatever it is that I'm walking through, whatever it is that I'm carrying. The knowledge and the reassurance that God is carrying it with me. He's carrying it for me. There's no need for me to be fearful, even though sometimes I might be. Even though my dysregulation is coming from a place of fear. And when the Bible says not to have a spirit of fear, I think it's really easy to just throw that around and shame one another for being fearful. But a spirit of fear means that you are operating from that place. It means that that is what is controlling you. That's what's directing your movements. That's what's motivating you, the fear. So no, we should not have a spirit of fear. We should not be consumed by the spirit of fear. We're going to be scared of things because we're people and the world is a scary place. But we should not get to a place where that fear makes any decision for us. I tell people all the time, if you're making the decision out of fear, then let's rethink it. You can make whatever decision you're going to make, all right? You have yourself and the Lord to be accountable to. But as you're thinking about the decisions that you're making, be honest with yourself about whether or not you are making them from a place of fear. When we are impulsive and our emotions get the best of us, sometimes we're acting out of fear, which is why we want to make sure that we understand how to regulate in those moments so that we don't. But I think that there are times, even when we're not being impulsive, that we're making decisions based on fear. Making decisions about a job, about a relationship, about a house, about a risk that we want to take. When fear is driving your decisions, then you're operating from a spirit of fear, and that's not godly. So what that means is that as Christians, we are willing to face the scary things because we don't have a spirit of fear. We're willing to face the scary things because we have the Spirit of God, which is victorious over everything already. So when we're feeling dysregulated, know that God is with you in that, and he's already on the other side of it, which means that he is the one who's going to be able to move you through this space of dysregulation, whether that be with his supernatural ability on his own, whether that be by way of reminding you that you have tools that are available to you, whether that be by you going outside and spending some time in nature. The other day I was driving and I just was really in my head. I was talking to God and I looked up and I saw a rainbow. I didn't even realize it had been raining that day. And I saw a rainbow as I was talking to God about just being kind of fearful and being really stressed and being really anxious. And he just gave me that reminder in that moment and said, like, I got this. I got this and I got you. It was all I needed. And I just like exhaled. You don't even realize sometimes how much tension you're holding until you give yourself permission to let it go. By acknowledging that God is with you in it, it gives you a little bit of permission to let go and to let some of that tension out. Not because it doesn't matter, but because somebody who can do something about it is already in control. Okay. I feel like we're getting through this fast today. This is feeling short. Don't get used to it. Don't get used to these short episodes. All right. Let's move on to our question of the day. Just as a reminder, if you have a question that you want answered on the show, please send me an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com, or you can leave a comment on social media at therapyandprayer, or here on YouTube if you're watching this. So I've gotten multiple versions of the same question, but this question says, what is the line in which I need to give my mental struggles to God? How do I know what to give to him and if I'm being too self-dependent? I'm struggling to understand what parts of the things I've learned in therapy are required to replace me with God. And I feel that it's hard to make this transition. So I think that the short answer to this is all of it. The question says, at what point do I need to give my mental struggles to God? Or like what parts of it do I need to give to God? All of it, right? I don't think that it should be separate. Like I'm over here dealing with my mental health and God is over here. I don't think that we should keep them separate. I think that we need to find a way for the two to merge. And a lot of times when we talk about mental health and when we talk about mental health in church spaces, there's been a lot of shame, and I think that we've come a long way from that. And I love to hear about Christians going to therapy and advocating for therapy. They work together. They work in tandem. When you're in therapy, you learn things about yourself, and it helps you know some of the things that maybe you need to bring to God. Maybe I didn't know that I had an issue with anger and control, but now that I know, I can talk to God about it. It's not a replacement for God. It's not that these are things that we work through without God, and then there are spiritual things that we work through with God. But it's an increased awareness of some things that you're dealing with or struggling with or have yet to heal from. It's that increased awareness which allows you to come to God in more authentic ways and in more transparent ways. This wasn't a part of the question, but this person also talked about feeling almost too self-dependent from going through therapy. And when you're in therapy and when you learn about all these tools and you just feel like really powerful and really empowered to like take control of your life and do these things, it can get to a place where you feel like you're the one who's moving anything forward and calling all the shots. And so we need to make sure that when we're doing anything, including therapy, that we're doing it with wisdom and with a spirit of discernment. If we are already including God in the therapeutic work from the beginning, acknowledging that this is not work that is separate from him, but that it's work that's done in tandem with him, then I think that will really help with that feeling of feeling too self-dependent. But also, if you have enough awareness to know that you're feeling too self-dependent, then that's a perfect opportunity for you to bring some of that to God instead. I don't know that there's really a firm line. Like these things you can handle on your own, but once you start, coming to this, then it goes to God, right? Like I don't know that I can sit here and say, if you're just dealing with anxiety and depression, that's fine. But if you're dealing with like abuse, then that needs to go to God, and you need to include him in those parts of it, because I don't think that that's the case. You can include God in every part of it and should include God in every part of it. When we don't, then we put more pressure on ourselves. to like get it right. And outside of therapy, outside of this work, what role does God play in your life? If God plays a centralized role in your life outside of therapy, then why wouldn't he play a centralized role in therapy? Now, if God doesn't play a centralized role in your life, but he's still important, he's like one of the important things, then I think that's going to be reflected in how you walk through this therapeutic work as well. So you decide what role God plays in your life. You decide the importance that you put on your relationship with him and his guidance in your life. I can understand wanting to find some balance there. And sometimes maybe feeling like, well, am I not trusting God because I'm taking this medication? Am I not trusting God because I have a therapist? And I don't think that's the case either. God has gifted everyone with certain things to be used for the kingdom. He has gifted some as doctors and some as therapists, and he has made resources available to us. Now, when we talk about medication and things like that, there's a lot that could be said about it, right? And do we have a healthy relationship with those things, or are we becoming dependent on them? I think that when we start to develop any sort of dependency or chemical dependency, then we're getting into a different kind of territory. So I think that's something that each person is going to have to look at for themselves individually. But if you feel like these things are separate or need to be separate, then I want you to give yourself permission to include God on your therapy journey, because he's already there. Like we've been talking about, he's already there. So acknowledge his presence and embrace his presence in it. And ask him for guidance as you're walking through it. And then when you go to therapy, bring those things back to God. So it's like a ping pong back and forth. Like this is not isolated apart from God. Nothing that we do is isolated apart from God. So I really hope that spoke at least to a part of the question that you were asking. I don't have a concrete answer because I just don't think that it needs to be separate. Include God in all of your mental struggles. Honestly, he made the brain, he made the mind, so he ought to be included in the maintenance and upkeep of it, I think. Okay, that's all that I have for y'all. Thank you guys so much for listening. Go watch Inside Out too, if you haven't already. Let me know what you think about it. Let me know what you think about the episode. I love you so much, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of Therapy and Prayer. Make sure you're subscribed and following wherever you listen to podcasts. And if the spirit moves you, go ahead and leave us a review. If you want to submit a question to be answered on this show, send us an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com. And make sure you're following us on TikTok at Therapy and Prayer. Thanks again for listening. I'll talk to you soon.